This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be tuned. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square, and where once in a while, if you go on our website, you can get swag, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. As always, my name is Rob Henderson, and I am the priest over at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
And my name is Kevin George, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see I may be wrong, but I highly doubt it because I am a George. So it's Kevin George from St. Aidan's Church
nice.
Up in Northwest London, Ontario, and happy to be back together with my two buds.
And my name is Iain. I'm a singer-songwriter and the producer behind this lovely here podcast that you are listening to.
He is incredible, that guy.
All right, good to see you guys. We remain in our pandemic lockdown, but that's okay. It gives us a chance to focus on some of this great stuff we enjoy doing on the podcast and getting a chance to talk to a lot of wonderful people from their homes because they're stuck there too. So this has been really good. And today we will be heading out west, I understand, to the West Coast welcome in the father of the missional church movement. Alan Roxburgh is our guest, and he'll be joining us in a minute. Yeah, he's got a lot of good books out. Talking a lot about, where do we meet God in the neighborhood, right?
Amen.
So good stuff. So we'll talk to him shortly.
Yeah, well, I guess before we go too far into that, we want to acknowledge the land that we are upon as we're recording here on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township Treaty, somber treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be a home of diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, Inuit neighboring communities whom we all love and respect, and we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors to the society at large. We continue to work and pray for today when we live in full reconciliation.
We want to thank our sponsors, as always, on the Vicar's Crossing. We've got three wonderful local businesses here in the London area that are great support to us, and we thank them to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. Our thanks to Dave Mullen and his entire staff for their support.
Fantastic. He's a good guy. As I keep saying, you want to be around him unless it's a business transaction. But other than that, you want to be around them. So I want to give a shout out to Carol Basato over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Got a fresh shipment of insulin this week, boys. So I feel like, you know what? Every time I jab myself with the insulin, I think one day it'll be Pfizer vaccine.
That's right. Moving on up.
Someday it will not be insulin. Anyway, in the meantime, until I get that, Carol is keeping me hooked up because she's got this beautiful pharmacy called Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. It's locally owned, it's locally operated, and locally we all love it. If you live in London, get away from the big boxes and the multi-billion-dollar people with their hands in your pocket. Go support a local business and see Carol.
Absolutely. And last but 100% certainly not least, to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. They recently came in and did some cleaning around the house. As you can clearly see, they did not clean the room that is behind me. But the rest of our house spotless. They did a wonderful job. We want to say a big thanks to them. Trisha Lister for that one.
Did she come personally and do that, Trisha? I feel like she wouldn't do that.
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. But
you make it sounding like you got yellow tape crossed in front of your door that nobody shall
I
dare
have
enter
a
into
I
the
have a girls not
A
allowed
hazmat.
or
Oh, come on now.
that's
Come on now. Hazmat. He probably
Hazmat
has like
suit.
a hazmat suit and
Yeah.
the whole thing, right?
Yeah, you
yeah,
actually have there's a decontamination thing just outside my door.
Yeah,
They have to
Spray
enter.
walk through a mist when you come in. Or
Yeah.
actually, when you go out, you have to go through
Yeah.
a mist to get
Yeah.
cleansed.
Well, someday when this pandemic ends, Kevin and I want to enter the inner sanctum.
Yeah,
so
we'll
we're
go
going
in
to
and
come
clean
over
the
there
room.
and surprise
We're
you.
going to go
one
in
day.
and clean the room.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. All right, guys. So we got a couple things we want to do in a minute, but let's just quickly check in and see how everybody's coping with everything. There's a little talk that there may be a light at the end of the tunnel in London, that because our case counts have been so low, that we may be moving into opportunity to open up a bit more. So we'll
They're
see.
talking about, Robbie, they're talking about leapfrogging from red past the orange all the way over to the yellow.
Wow.
Whoa, holy smokes.
Yeah. So, Iain, we might be back
Anarchy.
in church again soon with people besides the three of us. You know?
Whoa.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It scares me a little bit.
It's a big change.
I got to be honest,
know,
it does scare me
It
too.
does
because
scare me. Yeah.
I think we're all so concerned right now. We'll have to see. We'll make a decision.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But anyway, I know that gives some people some
There's
hope.
some hope.
And especially this time of year in February, where we just want to get out a little bit. And
Don't we, though?
so we're hoping for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Everything else okay, guys?
Yeah, hanging
you
in
know.
there.
You hanging
Mm-hmm.
in, buddy? You playing some music or what?
Yeah. You know.
He doesn't
know.
sound too enthused by it, but we had our vestry meeting on Sunday, our annual meeting, Robbie,
Oh, yeah.
and that all went well. And I always do a video, with photos from the year. So this year there was a lot of photos of screens, and and the like of the things that we did in 2020. We all sat in front of a computer.
Nice. Yeah.
But put some highlights from the podcast on, actually, some of our fun interviews with Romeo Dallaire and Nadia Bowles-Weber, John Pavlovitz.
Oh, that's good.
But we always need music to back it up. And
Yeah.
we had great music this year because we had the music of Iain's from
Nice.
Somebody's Journal laid over the background of those great photos.
Yeah. Well, that's fun because, we do some recording too at our parish for services on Sunday. And we kept a whole bunch of bloopers.
Yep.
Of me tripping
Oh, yeah,
over my
perfect.
words and stuff like that. And we put some Benny Hill music underneath it. We played that at our vestry. Yeah, so it was quite the show. And if anybody knows our churches up in the corner, our commissioners Southdale and
Wellington. Where
Very
are you
busy.
anyway? Do you know where you are?
I don't know where I am. I haven't been there for a while.
Yeah.
But what usually happens on Sunday mornings is right when I start to preach is when the sirens start to go on.
Oh,
that
yeah.
corner.
Yeah. It's a busy
There's
corner.
a fire station right next door, so we had
Yeah.
some of that. And
Yeah, it's
anyway, we do what we can do, right?
fantastic.
All right,
Mhm.
guys, want to start our
Let's play a
new
game.
segment here? Yeah, it's a new game, and Iain, if you're ready, it's a new game that we like to call.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
Ah. Okay. All right. Say
spiritual
more.
truth.
Say more, Robbie. What is this? I mean,
Yeah.
I know, I sort of
so-
know, but we could have new listeners. So what's going on with this game?
So what we do is one of us is going to tell a little story about ourselves, and it's up to the other two and to you listening or watching to try to figure out if they're telling a lie or if they're telling the truth. But remember, if they are lying and they believe it,
Yeah.
it's not really a
It's-
lie.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
It's not a lie if you believe it. How very standish.
So I think it's Kevin's turn this week.
My turn.
He stumped us last time, Iain, so I think it's Kevin's turn.
Well, Iain got it right last time. Remember, he
oh,
said
yeah.
he said that I probably did meet Martin Sheen, but I didn't smoke
Oh,
because
yeah.
I don't smoke, right? So
Right.
he
Right.
actually
You
nailed
got
it,
half
like,
of it right.
Yes.
dead on. Anyway, I think the story I want to tell you this week, and it's not a lie, but you can decide if you think it is or not. But anyway, you all know I'm news junkie, right? I love the news. I absolutely love I watch news channels nonstop. Part of, I think, that is in my family. It's in our genes. I know in our house at 6 o'clock news hour, you had to shut up, sit down, listen, and that was that. No debate. Well, what a lot of people don't know about me is that this sort of goes back in the family. So are any of you familiar with Rachel Maddow?
Oh, of course, on
Rachel Maddow.
CNBC,
Yeah, MSNBC.
MSNBC,
Right? Or whatever it is, or maybe it is CM. I don't know. It's MSNBC, yeah, or MSNBC, however you say that. She's on 9 o'clock every night anyway. I listen to the podcast because she's family. So Rachel Maddow's mother is from Torbay, Newfoundland. Her name is Elaine Goss, and Elaine's maternal grandmother and my maternal, I think it will be like great grandmother, were sisters. And so like we're some sort of distant cousins. So I have this thing that, someday I might be able to do the news like my cousin Rachel Maddow. So that's what I'm telling you today.
You're related to Rachel Maddow.
Yep.
That's the story.
Yep.
And remember, Iain, he's not lying if he believes it.
Yeah.
So,
Huh.
interesting.
What do you
That's
think,
really
boys?
interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know if that ship is sailing for me. I could maybe connect someone that's famous, maybe related to your family, but not to that level of maybe the top 2 or 3 news anchors in the United States.
So Robbie feels
So
I'm
going to say,
she's also a
sorry,
Rhodes-
I love you, but I think you're lying through you.
she's also a Rhodes Scholar, by the way, which I mean,
Yeah,
come on.
yeah,
I mean, come on.
yeah. Well, come on, there you go.
I may be wrong, but I highly doubt it because I'm a George.
I think you're weaving one, my friend. What about
What do you say, Iain?
I don't know. That seems like a very 6 degrees of separation kind of thing.
Okay.
So I don't know. I keep going back and forth because like on one hand, like it's totally possible,
Yeah.
because like it's my
Very possible.
the mother of whatever the cousins.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like
You got to pick, man.
I
Come on,
think
it's an hour show.
Come on, man.
I think you were lying. I don't think.
Okay, so you both figure it's a lie.
Yeah.
It's a lie.
Okay, well, you're both very sharp today. It is a lie. Her mother is from Torbay, Newfoundland, and her name is she is a Goss, but there's no relation to my family whatsoever.
There's no relation.
Gotcha.
But
Okay.
that's pretty cool though to have
Yeah.
that connection so close to home though. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I thought I'd give you that, but when you were starting to go down family lineage, no. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Almost
All right,
had me.
that's not a it's not a lie if you believe it. And the other thing we're doing this month is it's February, and that's Black History Month. So each one of us is taking a time just to hold up someone that we want to highlight on Black History Month. That's important to us. So Kevin, you're up again.
So this week I want to highlight Willie O'Ree. So I'm a big hockey fan, as you know, and without Willie O'Ree, there's no PK Subban or Jerome McGinley, Grant Fuhrer, any of these guys that have been incredible hockey players in later years, all made it because of the fact that Willie O'Ree broke the color barrier way back when. So I want to hold him up. He played for the wrong team, the Boston Bruins, briefly. And then if it weren't for color issues, I'm sure he would have played a longer career. He's from New Brunswick. He continues to work in the game. He's now a Hall of Famer. He's an incredible man. And what's really incredible is he made the NHL with one eye. He was blind in one eye, and he kept it a secret from everyone except the doctor who told him, because if it got out there, he would have never made it. And so anybody knows how hard it is to make the NHL with 2 eyes. He made it with 1. And so he's an incredible guy. His hockey playing, his commitment to the community, the way that he's carried himself throughout his life, and the inspiration he's been to so many. And now that he's a hockey ambassador since '98 with the NHL, work he's doing is incredible. So for Black History Month, my guide today, Willie O'Ree, my kind of guy.
All right. Another good guy that we're going to be chatting with now is Alan Roxburgh, and he is joining us on the Vickers Crossing podcast. So we're going to bring him into our room and continue our chat with him.
All right, come on, Alan.
And here he is into our Zoom room on the Vickers Crossing. We welcome Alan Roxburgh to the program, or Alan to the program. Alan, wonderful to see you. And how are you today?
I'm doing well. A beautiful warm day in sunny British Columbia, so I can't be anything but feeling good.
Awesome. That's great. How are you guys making out there with this madness we're calling the pandemic? Of you?
Well, like the rest of you, we are both trying to be locked down and getting pretty fed up with it.
Yeah. We've been saying that every week when we do these. We've just had enough. We've just had enough. But,
you go through a whole series of stuff, and I think we're at had enough stage.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Hey, well, we're so glad you could be with us.
Yeah.
And Kevin wants to introduce you to our listeners, a more formal introduction, if you don't mind. So, Kevin, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, I'm really excited that we've got Alan with us today because, as I said to him before we came on here, his books have been really foundational for me, particularly this last decade or so. This work around missional church. I mean, really, Alan is the father of the missional church movement, if you ask me. He's the guy that's the preemptive voice on all this. Alan's life, he writes, was shaped by a search to understand what it means to be a part of God's movement in our world. Raised in the inner city of Liverpool. Who else? Who else came from there, Rob?
Not many people.
Liverpool.
Liverpool?
Yeah.
No,
No, I
no.
never heard of anybody.
It's a pretty unknown place.
It's an unknown place, Liverpool, but Iain probably knows. He's into the singing songwriting business. But certainly come from a place where there was a depressed economy and a close-knit sense of belonging. And I think you'll find that his experience of that comes out in his writing. Alan immigrated to Canada in the turbulent 60s, where he redirected his life and university towards the church. And as a young pastor, he learned that it's fairly easy to grow churches, but that growth was somewhat called circulation of the saints, or as I like to call it, moving checker pieces around the checkerboard. It's like, it's not real growth. Early on, he realized that his generation and all those who had to come had already left the church behind as any kind of meaningful response to the increasing unraveling of Western society since the late 1970s. And so for more than 30 years, Alan has been involved in writing, serving as a pastor, as a consultant, doing missional formation and incredible work. He is, I think, sort of out of the pastoring business now, aren't you? Are you sort of stepped back from that? Are you still pastoring a church or?
No, I am not pastoring a church.
No. So but I'm telling you, I think the man doesn't stop, is what I think. I think he's not slowed down. But some of his books include Reaching a New Generation, Leadership, Liminality, and Missionary Congregations, Crossing the Bridge, The Sky is Falling, Leaders Lost in Transition, The Missional Leader, incredible book, co-authored with Fred Romanuk, Introducing the Missional Church, Missional Joining God in the Neighborhood, Structured for Mission. My favorite of yours from more recent years is Joining God, Remaking Church and Changing the World, Practices for Refounding of God's People, The Missional Challenge of the West. And we have him on today because, among other things, we're going to be able to discuss a new book that is just recently released in February, in fact, which is called Leadership, God's Agency, and Disruptions, Confronting Modernity's Wager. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. By the way, I love the fact that you're not afraid of a long title.
No.
so
Let's scare them off right at the beginning.
That's right. Anyway, listen, you've done lots more than anything I could say in a few minutes, but we're just really thrilled to have you and glad that you make time for us here on the Vicar's Crossing.
It's good to be with you. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, let's jump in. Where I'd like to start actually is with some of that work around Joining God, that book.
Yeah, sure.
Joining God, Remaking Church, Changing the World, The New Shape of the Church in Our Time is the subtitle. It's an incredible book. In fact, I keep it on here and I revisit it regularly because it's the sort of thing that I think that if you're in a parish or a church community or a pastor, it's the sort of thing that we need these sort of reminders because the institution keeps trying to pull us back into these sort of practices. You write about, you use a metaphor in the book really early on. You write about your wife and her love of knitting. And she's unraveling a sweater, which I was really taken with because my mother was a knitter, and I saw what would happen when she'd find a mistake and have to unravel, or as we would say in Newfoundland, she'd ravel it out. She'd ravel it out, and she'd ravel it out, and I'd have to ball up the wool, and she'd do it again. It was quite an ordeal. And then she'd re-knit it, of course. And so when I read your metaphor, you use that as a metaphor about the unraveling of the church and its influence since the 60s. And your contention is that the Spirit has been at work in this long unraveling. You write, the Spirit is inviting these churches to embrace a new imagination, but the other imagination had to unravel for us to see it for what it was. In this sense, the malaise of our churches has been the work of God. Now, a lot of people in our institutions have a hard time grasping that the decline and the malaise and all of that could be the work of God. And so while God has been unraveling this old imagination, the church has been busy trying to knit back something which they consider the good old days. Let's get back to our full Sunday schools and our full churches. And they want the same old garment that we wore back in the 60s. I'm taken with the image because at nearly 50 years of age, I've seen all of these movements that you write about, right? Rob and I are in that generation of church where I think you said it's like 20% of us from our age group will be sort of hanging out in church. And a list of initiatives, just kind of like, natural church development and, emerging church and even missional church. And, you push more at the edges of that in this book. And you say it can be extended, liquid church, sticky church, fresh expressions. All of it's come along and all of it's been this thing that, it's going to save the church or we're going to get back to where we used to be. We've lived it all. In my lifetime, I don't ever remember a time when we did have the good old days, in fact. So for me, this is the church, this unraveling.
Yeah,
So you contend that God's disruptive, dislocating spirit is continuing to call the churches onto a different journey.
Yes.
And after these 50 plus years of unraveling, people might be ready. You're saying they might be ready to hear the Spirit's voice in fresh ways. So it's been 5 years since that book. So Alan, I guess the question, the two-part, people might finally be ready to hear the Spirit in fresh ways. Are you seeing evidence of that? A, and B, are clerics as open to that fresh voice as lay folks are?
There are growing numbers of Christians in congregations and not in congregations who are responding to that voice or are hearing that voice. So yes, there is something fermenting there. That's number one. Number two, I think that the question of clerics, are they hearing that voice, there's not a simple single answer to that. I think there are groups of clerics who are hearing that voice and are going, that's not for me, that's not my world. Just leave me alone and let me live out the rest of my whatever I'm doing in a parish or congregation, and hopefully they've got one that can do that. I think there are growing numbers of clerics in kind of a broad middle who are hearing that voice and who are recognizing the truth of it, but are terrified by it because they actually don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's more the broad middle. And then I think there is another voice, a different voice and a growing voice that comes from probably, I don't like to use this line, a younger generation who really are already there and are trying to figure it out. They've left the story I'm trying to tell, and they're heading in a different way. So in terms of clerics, there are very many different responses, but what I think remains powerfully in place is what I wrote about in that little book, which is what I call this clergy-centric understanding of their identity and their role. And what I write about in other places as called kind of a clergy industry, that which gives them place and role and identity and is extremely hard to get out of. So I don't want to be critical of clergy because they signed up for something that's disappearing. And this is not about blame. If I were a clergy person today, I'd find it unbelievably disorienting in terms of my identity and role.
I actually, that's interesting to me. Like you said, there's that broad middle, and I think that's where the hope is. I think it is disorienting, right? So I think when I think about it and when I listen to you now say that, one of the things that comes to mind is, I think, I can't speak for Rob, maybe you jump in here too, Rob, but I feel like we signed on for something that was never really there.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think that what was sold to me in a way and I came into this very young, ordained at 25 or 26. So,
sure.
But in those days, coming out of Newfoundland, where everything washed up in Newfoundland about 25 years after it washed through Ontario. So we were having arguments that were 25 years old in the church out there.
Right.
Sure.
But I had this idea that I was going into something, and for the last 25 years, it's really been like this unraveling.
Yeah.
What about you, Robbie?
So, well, yeah, same idea, and I appreciate Alan naming that because I can see myself somewhere in that middle too often, because I grew up in the church and had an understanding of what a parish priest was and spent a lot of time in discernment in my 20s and 30s wondering if this is perhaps something that I'm being called to, and I finally moved toward that. And then to get into it, I've been 13 years ordained now, but to get into it with a picture of what it was, even going through a seminary process and then ending up in a different world, it has been disorienting in a lot of ways, because I did have a picture of what it was, and quite frankly, it's not that. So where do you fit in? Like, where's your place in that, right?
Right.
So yeah, no, I appreciate you naming that. It's important. Continuing with the book Joining God, I wanted to offer another quote for our listeners today, because what we're talking about really is transformation in a big way. And you write this, that we are witnessing a great transformation, and at the core of this change is the deep conviction that God is the primary actor who is out ahead of us and out in the neighborhood. The huge challenge for the Euro-tribal churches is how we come to release our techniques, management, and desire to fix the church, and instead believe that it is God who is acting out ahead of us, particularly in our neighborhoods. And I love this because this is right kind of in the wheelhouse of what we talk a lot about on our podcast, how faith intersects with the public square. And we started our podcast a couple of years ago, and we've heard a ton of different guests talk about how disruptive God is in the neighborhood, and that they're living that and witnessing to that as well.
Great.
And you note that this kind of calls us away from ecclesiocentrism and church questions and toward a whole set of disruptive questions about what God is up to and how we can join in. And it calls us into that risky space of discerning where God is. Can you talk a little bit more about perhaps where you see this at work, and maybe what those disruptive questions look like for those of us that want to go out and find God in the neighborhood?
Well, there's a number of different ways of coming at this. If you are, and please redirect me if I'm not addressing what we're doing. But if you are a clergy person who has the responsibility of oversight or management or pastoral care of a congregation, and you are recognizing this, these disruptions that are going on, which I talk about a lot in that and other books, the question then arises, what do I do about it? How do I engage it? And the built-in responses, the defaults, are going to come from our training and our experiencing and the modeling that's been given to us by other people. Mm-hmm. And that means that what we will do almost automatically in this unraveling is try to find ways of making the church work better, whether that's, improved liturgies, better pastoral care, or it's setting up a commission to investigate how to read the community better so that we can create programs and ways of engaging it. And so whether we are using assessments of neighborhoods or this, all of these things are trying to deal with the unraveling by using all of the methods that we've been taught that are causing the unraveling.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So
wow.
So and principally, and this is counterintuitive to a lot of clergy because they're taught to understand themselves as humble kinds of people, or servants. They're all this language that goes around, but in essence, the very fact that and I'm talking to clergy here, the very fact that you get educated at a university and then you go to seminary, which is a professional school, and then you get a degree as a professional, you're actually entering a guild. And you've been trained and formed on the practices of that guild. And overall, and I'm using a lot of shorthand here, the basic understanding of training is to make you an expert inside a set of practices that give you management and control. This is the expertise culture that we've created. And therefore, when you get to a place of unraveling in your churches, you feel responsible because it's your job to come up with the plan, the action, to manage and control the outcomes that you need. So that's the narrative in which clergy are living all the time. So for example, let me give you a simple example. What we've done over the last numbers of years, and you'll see my dog in the background there, and I've contributed to it, is people are looking to the neighborhood, right?
Yep.
But what pops up are all kinds of programs to do things in the neighborhood assessments, and, you know, take a read of the assets of your neighborhood and the assets of your church and figure out how to match those assets in order to blah, 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 without recognizing that all of these activities are themselves reiterations of this need to manage and control outcomes, to predict and be in control. Strategies.
Strategic planning.
Yeah, it's all that in different language.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. And this is the difficult shift that requires the risk, which is a different kind of conversation.
Yeah.
What I'm proposing, I'm more than proposing it, I believe it because I see it, is that God's Spirit has and always is moving ahead of us. And the role of clergy, if it is to survive, needs to fundamentally shift, not throw everything away, but fundamentally shift, where we become those who are forming communities of God's people, who are learning to dwell and live in their neighborhoods and communities. Now, stop me if I'm going too far, but let me stop with that one. Most people in most congregations, most parishes, do not dwell and live in their neighborhoods.
No.
They have friends all over the place.
Yeah.
And those friends tend to be affinity friends that are like them, talk like them, wag like them, and squeak like them.
Yeah.
And they come together like that. So they actually aren't dwelling. They're not present.
Right.
In fact, as an Anglican, it continues to bemuse me that a lot of the Anglican clergy I know don't live in the parishes to which they're called.
That's right.
And you begin to go, like, just begin there.
Mhm.
So my point is that God's up to something ahead of us, but we're not going to figure it out with a commission. We're not going to figure it out by hiring a strategic consultant to develop a strategy for the next 10 years.
Who is my neighbor? We had that one here.
We're going to discover it by learning again to dwell in our neighborhood, and in that dwelling, to begin to learn to ask the question, what is it that God is doing here? Now that's called discernment.
That's right.
And what I'm proposing and what I'm writing is that that strategic planning, that adaptive change, that innovation, all of these methods borrowed from other places, while they have a place, it's not the lead place. And it's not the way to see what God is doing. To see what God is doing requires discernment.
Well,
discernment requires a fundamentally different set of skills and practices for which clergy were never trained in seminary. So that's the shift I'm talking about. Now, I'm not talking about that blowing smoke through my ears.
I'm glad you.
Talking about that out of real grounded practice and action and activity. Like, there are ways of doing this. So I'm not just throwing a nice idea out. Let me stop.
Robbie, I think about going back about 10 or 15 years now in this diocese, we had something called the Who is My Neighbor Commission. Okay, you talk about God being out in the neighborhood.
Right.
So we doled out $150,000 to have a consultant come in and visit all of our congregations. And out of that, Rob is actually in a church now. He wasn't there then. That was a beautiful cedar church on one of the busiest corners in town. That is now,
is that right?
It's now bright blue, and it looks like it's a Rona. Because the biggest thing that came out of the Who is My Neighbor Commission is paint your doors yellow, paint your churches blue, paint your stuff red, so that when people driving by see you.
So what does that tell you about the subject of the conversation?
Well,
that
I mean,
it's navel. It was about navel gazing to me. It's like, how do we get people to stare at us?
stare
right?
at us.
How do we get people to look at us
What a narcissistic
instead of
approach
us
to
going
ministry.
out and looking at you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
So the point isn't asking the question, who is my neighbor?
No.
The point is of this journey is actually dwelling with and being with the next person next door and across the street and around the corner. Right. And in the midst of that, learning to listen to them without now, that's the hard work.
Right.
That's the hard work.
It's uncomfortable.
And when we start painting our doors or prettying up around the outside, it's really trying to attract. It's the old attractional model.
Right. Well, as a concrete example, I can share with you that right now we've been discussing putting a community garden in some green space that we have. Yeah. And one of the suggestions that came up was, well, why don't we go to one of the current city plots that rent out space for gardens where other people are dwelling in the neighborhood and put our garden there instead of wanting to have the garden in front of the church so that people will look at the church and say, oh, aren't they great? Look at them feeding the neighborhood. I say, well, why don't we go out in the neighborhood and drop it in there? And the resistance and the pushback is incredible, right? Yeah. Because it's still in that mindset of having to look at us.
And there will be pushback. And you see, here's the thing that over and over and over again, what you'll learn is that simply creating a space where people in your congregation could have conversation with people in their neighborhood community will create a great deal of anxiety.
Yes.
Okay, because what goes on inside the church is no different than what goes on outside, which is we have created a whole social milieu in which we do not connect with each other at all. Right. And the other is scary.
Right.
And the neighbor has become the other. So I don't want to pretend that this is not really hard work.
It's difficult. And it's disruptive.
This is the gospel work.
Yeah.
It's very disruptive.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, and you in your recent book, which I should add, you co-authored with Mark Lau Branson.
Yes.
You really, I mean, I think that the two of you really sort of go after this in a way in this new book, because essentially it's about God's agency. I mean, we in institutional church get bogged down into thinking it's about us and that it's our agency. But your book is called Leadership, God's Agency and Disruptions. As I say, it's incredibly disruptive, as you just said, and confronting modernity's wager. So off the top, just before I ask you a question about it, perhaps for our listeners who are haven't heard that turn of phrase, modernity's wager. What is it? Why does it matter? Why do we confront it?
Yeah, sure. We all know that we have lived for, put up whatever number on it, 300-400 years in what's called modernity. Mm-hmm. And that modernity, the modern world, is a radical break with everything that's gone before. That's number one. But what kind of break is it? What is it that is specific to the character of the modern? And there's lots of things you can say, but what I'm saying is that at the very bottom, modernity is a massive wager. And the wager is that life can be lived well without God. That's modernity's wager. Mm-hmm. Now you can put all kinds of other things around it, isms and all that, but that's modernity's wager. And it shows up. And so fundamentally what replaces God as the central agent are things like the economy, particularly consumer capitalism.
Consumerism, yeah.
Okay? If I can get a good job in that, all the good things will come to me. Who the hell needs God?
Yeah.
The state becomes that.
Nationalism.
And the individual. Mm-hmm. So this is the what I would call the new trinity
Mhm.
of modernity's wager.
Yeah.
Without getting into it, because people can read it, my argument is the church bought that wager hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
And I don't mean the church stopped believing in God. It's just that God became useful.
Right.
God became the footnotes or the prayer that you use at the end of all your own planning and organizing and programmatizing and developing. And so the church became actually fundamentally no different than the rest of the culture.
Right.
But what's happening now is, as we enter a period of late modernity, the confidence in the self, the politics, and the economics is disappearing. The confidence in this wager is gone.
Right.
But the church looks no different than anybody else.
Right.
So
We're behaving in the same patterns.
the church has become fundamentally useless.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, because I look at Iain here, right? Like Iain is just about 20. So,
Oh.
so I look at Iain and I think about what you just said. And Iain, I would say, not to speak for you, Iain, but Iain and many in his generation have become fundamentally disillusioned with consumer economy and
Sure,
the
absolutely.
nation and all that stuff. But what they haven't seen is, in a large part, is a church that behaves any differently than the rest of all that. Am I wrong, Iain?
Correct. Yeah.
Remind me again what disillusioned means.
Well, you're not terribly excited about the current sort of political, economic realities of the world, and that that all this consumerism and buying and accumulating is the
Yeah.
way for, like, you don't see that as the way forward. That's not
No,
your
a-
outlook on life.
Yeah, a lot of my friends are very angry about how consumerism and capitalistic that our world has become, and how it's all like, what can I get out of it, and where can I go to get the most out of whatever, and sort of a lot about me, like what can I do and what can I get,
Mhm.
kind of vibe. And also like
Yeah.
craziness of politics, 2016, don't really need
Right.
to mention the past 4 years. So
Yeah, but I guess the question is, as I think about you, Iain, and I mean, I understand that you're here hanging out at St. Aidan's and so on, but on a large part, though, you don't. I mean, and we talked about this before on the podcast. I mean, Iain in his post-secondary schooling or his high schooling didn't have a host of friends who were all running off to church on Sunday morning, and I would say that a lot of what you see in the church is not too dissimilar from what you see in society at large. Same approach.
Yeah.
So
Fair enough. Yeah.
I think about that, and I just to go a little deeper into the book, Alan, you remind the reader that God, as we had said, is the primary agent in the world, and you contend that God comes to us in a particular kind of way, without the pretense. And I think that this is where this part of the conversation becomes important. God comes to us without the pretense of power and control, which is
Yeah.
what all the rest of that stuff seems to be about.
Correct.
God meets us in this space between. And you use that phrase a fair bit, space between,
Correct.
where there can be neither power nor control. This theological imagination, which is something that we desperately in need of, imagination, I would say, this theological imagination, you argue, must now form the basis of Christian leadership and must become the means of assessing all other leadership models we choose to take up. This should not be earth-shattering for those of us in the church, but for those of us who are clerics and have had to sit through meetings and listen to people's fear around all this disruption and everything else, it sometimes feels like this sort of imagination, the imagination to think of a world where power and control are not the primary thing, seems a long way off. Talk to us about theological imagination and that in between, that space between, and why it's so critical.
Yeah. And imagination there's a lot of ways of talking about that, but it's the stories inside us that are shaping how we see and engage in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it. And that's as I've said, I'll just mention it again, but won't say a lot about it. My argument is that the core imagination into which we have been formed is this technocratic rationality, this capacity to make things happen, to to control and to manage. But that is not, let's move to the theological. That is not the God who we meet in the Eucharist.
Right. Power and control, not a part of that.
That is not what comes to us.
No.
God meets us in vulnerability, in weakness, and God meets us in dependence, which is a strange thing to say in the midst of our culture. But in the incarnation, Jesus enters the space of dependence without power and control.
Yeah.
And this is part of what I mean by space between.
Yeah.
It is First Nations peoples have different language for this, but they between them as tribes, there's space. And it is not contested space.
Right.
And it's not owned space, but it's the space where they meet, and therefore they meet not in control, not owning, not with power, not with contestation, but to meet the other.
Right.
That's how and where God meets us. And so that's the kind of theological imagination I'm beginning to talk about. Now, if you begin to go there and want to live in that kind of theological imagination, you cannot live in what is the strategic plan of the Anglican Church of Canada for the next 10 years. You can't live there. That is a non sequitur.
That's right.
Right? You have to live in a completely different kind of place and space. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not in any way suggesting that that's all passive and you're not doing anything about it. But what I am saying, as God's people, in this unraveling that we're in, if we're ever going to grasp how to be God's people in the midst of this, then we need a theological imagination of the kind I've described. And again, I want to say, I'm not saying this as pie in the sky. I'm saying this out of working on the ground with parishes and congregations and systems. And how do you do this?
Right.
But let me stop and see if I'm getting at what you're asking.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I think the challenge is because what you're talking about is faithfulness. You're talking about and you're writing about, and you're talking about this in on the ground, as you say, with communities, encouraging us to be bold enough to actually rely on God's agency instead of this notion that there's a way to rationally figure it all out. I mean, it's the very root of our baptism. I mean, if we're prepared to lean on God for and it's very liminal as well. I mean, that First Nations metaphor, for instance, of that space in between, it's a really there's a liminal nature to this, that if we're willing to actually enter into a more modern monasticism, so to speak, and enter into real discernment practices and real practices of engagement with our faith walk, then there's a place for us to get to, I believe.
Yeah, it's interesting that I'll just make this comment and then go where you want to go. Is that I wrote that book, Joining God, 5 years ago.
Yeah,
and about a year and a half ago, I sat down and asked, okay, what have I learned? Because lots of people were saying, love this book. How do we do it? Right. And so I began to work with lots of them. And so I began this writing about what have I learned? And it's actually turned into another book that's coming out in about 2 months.
Okay.
And, but the book's content changed at the end of it. But here's what I'm trying to say, is that in the creation stories, God creates Adam and then Eve, whatever, and it says that, and Adam knew Eve, knowing, which of course is is part of what underlies this conversation we're having, is that as our world unravels, as the role of clergy unravels, the natural question is, how do I know what to do, right? And in the modern narrative, knowledge has to do with getting the information and the data and the programs and the skills in order to manage and control.
Yes.
That's why church systems hire consultants to bring them plans for their future, right? Right? Antithetical to what God does. Whereas knowing in that biblical context, which has to do with sexual union, is about something completely different.
Right.
It's about the risk of relationship in which you are not in control and you are vulnerable. And what I'm saying is that's the journey
Yes.
that we're being invited to take. And it is a journey into our neighbors and communities.
Right.
Now, related to that is for in our work, one of the primary biblical pieces for this is Paul's meeting with Lydia outside of Philippi, where Paul and his companions, do you want me to go on, or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, this is
Tell us. This is
perfect.
fantastic.
Paul and his companions had gone on the second missionary journey, right? That's what it's called.
Yes.
And their plan was and they had a plan. You got to get this. They had a plan, was to revisit all of the house churches that they'd formed and to plant new ones, to use contemporary language.
Right.
And when you get to Acts 16, you get this message, and it says, and the Spirit prevented them.
Yes.
And the Spirit of Jesus prevented them. That every time they tried to go back to where they'd been before or enter into their planned new territories, they were stopped. They were thwarted.
Yeah.
Now, Paul had a model in his head. What he would do, he'd go into a town or a city and he'd look for the synagogue. And because he was a rabbi, they let him preach in the synagogue, and he'd preach Jesus.
Yeah.
And if those in the synagogue said, this is great, then he'd set up a synagogue of Yesu, and a little church was formed. If they didn't want to go along with it, he'd go to a house next door and he'd set up a house church. So that was his method. That was his plan. All the time on the second journey, the Spirit says, no, 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 no. He's thwarted. Now, lots of explanations for that. He gets to Troas, and he has this vision, remember, of the man of Macedonia. Right?
Yeah.
Immediately, they get in a boat and they head off to Philippi. Okay. Now, Philippi is a Roman colony, right? It's kind of new. It's in Europe. It's outside the realms of what they'd been in before. So what does Paul do? He goes into Philippi, and what does he look for? A synagogue. Because that's what he knows. That's the method. That's the pattern. That's how it works. He can't find one.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
So it says he goes outside the city gates. Translated, he quits the church and heads into the neighborhood.
Yes.
What does he do outside the city gates? He looks for a place of prayer. Now, a place of prayer is shorthand for a proto-synagogue. He's still trying to do the same old thing. In the midst of that, he does the impossible. He sits with Lydia, who's a Gentile God believer. And what happens is that Lydia gets converted. And a house church springs up out of Lydia that Paul and his gang would never have imagined in all their planning in all the time. Now, what am I saying here? The long period of this is that we are still obsessed with asking the question, how do we fix our churches and make them work again?
Keep going back to the synagogue. Yeah.
Still give that. Whereas what the Spirit is saying is, you will only know what the church is going to look like in retrospect.
Right.
Only by going out beyond the gates and discovering Lydia's will you discover what the church is going to look like.
It's incredible.
That's the scary move that we're being invited into. That's the radical shift of what's going on. Now, let me just finish this because I know what people accuse me of. I am not saying we throw away our liturgy.
No.
Or the Eucharist. I'm not saying that at all.
No.
But I'm saying we'll never answer the question, what the heck do we do in the midst of this unraveling as church, by asking the question, what do we do with church?
Right.
We got to ask radically different questions.
Yeah. And it's hard because a lot of,
powerful.
Isn't it though, Rob? Like that's.
Yeah. That whole treatment of that sounds so eerily familiar. That's because you were just explaining what we've been doing, right?
Yeah.
So you're exactly right.
Yeah.
And I did that journey into the story of Paul and Lydia is to me, it's revelatory for clerics. Speaking of clerics, I'm sure Iain is wondering what the heck all this clerical stuff is. You got one over there, Iain?
Well, you write about the clergy industry, which kind of sounds like a factory in a way.
It is.
It is.
And so for the last couple of years, I've been hanging out with these two chuckleheads over here. And you mentioned the clergy industry before, and I want to know what it is and sort of what goes on there.
Sure. It has a history, and it. So I'll give you the brief one, but it comes out of denominations get formed, and all that has a history. And what these denominations do is begin to rationalize the kinds of ordained leaders that they need. And by what they do to that rationalizing is that they set up codes of practice. That is, what do you need to become one of these people inside our system? And then schools, which were never intended for this, schools become, in a sense, the adjuncts, the training adjuncts of denominations.
Factories.
Who train these clergy. And the method of training is basically in the story of the denomination, it's called its theology, and in the practices, which are basically how to become managers of branch plants, which are called congregations. Because remember, denominations are essentially the same as General Motors or Ford Motor Company. There's a massive central plant that manages and trains and produces. And then there are dealerships all across the country in which there are trained dealers of GM or Ford or Toyota. And so what begins to emerge, it's more complex than this, is an industry in which clergy learn a story, a narrative, and a set of habits and practices that are about the denomination and are carried out in the branch plants called parishes or congregations. And after a while, those in the parishes and congregations simply assume that that's what these clergy are about and that they ought to do. Basically, managers and caregivers and pastors of the local. That's the industry. And the schools are in the center of that industry. And what makes it so crucial is that their economic life is dependent upon that industry working. And what we're at right now is a place where that's not working. And the denominations have control over it. Well, both the schools and the denominations have the control of it because the denominations control the ordination process and the schools control the degree giving process.
Mhm.
That's what I mean by a clergy industry in which it's almost impossible to break out of in terms of that model. And the model has to be pulled apart if there's going to be any hope.
I think I just heard a bunch of bishops, all their tight muscles slam shut.
Well,
So-
think about the amount of time bishops and denominational executives spend managing and overseeing that process I've just described.
yeah, we've got Brian Mclaren coming on this week as well.
Oh, say hi to Brian. I haven't
I-
talked to him for a long while.
I will do,
Yeah.
but I'm just reading, like Rob, one of the questions while Rob was writing was about this very subject, really. I mean, the notion of statistical reports at the end of the year and
Oh,
how many
nuts.
how many bums did you have in pews on this Sunday and
Yeah.
that Sunday, and
There's probably less of that now.
Mm.
But the problem is, and you shouldn't let me go on like this, but the problem is
shouldn't.
that there's no imagination
it's the lack of
about how
imagination.
to shift that model. And so what's going on is that increasingly there's no full-time
Right.
jobs for these clergy, right? And so they're trying to think about, well, how do we deal with this?
Yeah.
And they're creating, each denomination has its own language, kind of
Oh, yeah.
lay train this or lay train
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And you look at their training,
Priests for specialized ministry.
and what they do is they take the MDiv
Yeah.
and they turn it into, like salad dressing and salad dressing light.
Yes.
Yes.
They turn it into MDiv light, and they train these lay people in that stuff.
Yes.
And the question I ask these leaders is, like, if we've spent 60 or 70 years creating MDivs for our denominations, and we're all falling off the edge of the cliff, can you tell me what we're achieving by training these lay people in MDiv light?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
How's that working for you?
Yeah.
Well, and I don't want to make light of the situation.
No, I know, but it's a real thing. We're experiencing it on the ground, aren't we, Rob? I mean, it's,
Oh, we're living it right now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're
But
living it.
here's what I
And,
want to say to you. I've said it 3 times. I won't say it anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this as an idealist who's got nothing, doing nothing. I am working on the ground in my local neighborhood, and I'm working with clergy and systems in actually how you get out of this.
Right.
Mhm.
So
Well-
this is not smoking.
No, this is why, folks, if
No,
I
yeah.
can't encourage you enough to pick up Alan's books, because they really are the meat of things. Listen to the last one before we have you go, and Rob is going to ask you a little question
Yeah, good.
in a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about the road is made by walking.
Yes.
And so Antonio Machado, Machado.
Antonio Machado.
Machado, there you go. My Spanish is not what it should be.
It's-
But in Newfoundland, we didn't talk a lot. In Spaniards Bay, to one community, maybe they did. I don't know. They talk funny over there. I know that. And but the poem, just for our listeners: Traveler, your footprints are the only road, nothing else. Traveler, there is no road. You make your own path as you walk. As you walk, you make your own road. And when you look back, you see the path you will never travel again. Traveler, there is no road, only a ship's wake on the sea. Of this expression, the road is made by walking, you write that it doesn't mean a strategy for making a road. It's not about a new road construction to take us to a new goal. And you write, rather, the road is discovered. It's discerned as we start walking with recognition. We are on an unnameable present, a place where we don't know where we're treading. The intent of this walking is to discover how to listen for and discern the way of God is ahead of us in the local. The
Yep.
road is not the object like some blueprint, nor is it to bring us to a destination, an end. This road won't answer questions like where are we going? What's the destination? Where on the map do we need to be? Rather, we walk to lay down a road that provides ways of hearing God on the ground. I wonder if you can say more about this, because I mean, we hang out with a lot of people who are certain that this whole practice is about a destination, that a destination is the goal. You know, if you just get it right now, sometime in the afterlife, we'll all have it wonderful and so on. it's as though the whole practice is about the road and how we build it and what it's for and where it's taken us. But I love this expression that the road is made by walking, and as a thought for real discernment and listening. Can you say more about that?
Sure, I can. You ask questions that require a lot of time to answer. That is one of the deep expressions of my belief of where we are and how we lead. That's number one. Number two, it comes out of an utter conviction that this is God's world, and that God is at work in this world in Jesus through the Spirit.
Amen.
That it comes out of the confidence. Number three, it comes out of a conviction that the Spirit is unraveling us as churches, and that we will not understand what God is doing by trying to figure out how to fix the church. So the Spirit is calling us out on a journey, and it's a scary journey because we've not done it for a very long time, and it's a journey of learning how to join God in our neighborhoods. But it's not a journey that answers the question, and what will all this look like? You will only discover what it's going to look like when you turn around and look back at the road that appears that you've been walking on. But that is about faith in God's agency, in the kingdom that will come. And in that faith, I do not need models. I don't need somebody to tell me the trends of the future and how to act and behave and all that. I need to be the one in a faithful community built around the liturgy and the Eucharist, who is in the neighborhood, continually discerning and joining with God. That's what this is about.
Amen.
I think the quote that popped into my head as you were talking, I think, is Desmond Tutu saying, do what you can do where you are, and God will surprise you. Be present in where you are, and focus on that. And God works in that. Yeah.
The great gift for a white male is to discover that you're not in control.
Exactly.
Great
Exactly.
gift.
Yep. So Alan, just before we let you go, it's February. It's Black History Month. We're just asking our guests
What are
to
you
wrap
saying
up our
that
shows.
white males are not in control? He said so.
That's right. That's right. We're just asking our guests to share someone that might come to mind in Black History Month that was an influence to them, or anybody. So I throw that over to you. Anybody that comes to mind?
The person who I've read every single thing he's ever written, and I've lived in it and dwelt in it and been turned upside down in it, is James Baldwin. I can't explain to you the extent to which his writing has affected and influenced my life. So that is the person who, in Black History Month, is foremost for me.
Listen, have you read or heard of Pastor Lenny Duncan?
I have not. No.
He wrote a book a couple of years ago called "Dear Church," a love letter from a black preacher to the whitest congregation in America. It's he's a Lutheran pastor. He's an incredible guy. He's been he ran away from home in Philadelphia at 13. He's an African American. He was jailed. He was a sex worker. He was a drug addict. Now he's a Lutheran pastor, and his new book, which is coming out, is called "The United States of Grace." And we interviewed him last week, and we asked him who his person was, and he said Uncle Jimmy Baldwin.
Uncle Jimmy Baldwin.
Call him Uncle Jimmy.
Yeah. So 2 weeks in a row, our guests have used James Baldwin. So
we should all. I mean, you shouldn't say these things, but we should all read James Baldwin.
I agree.
He was a prophet, a deeply understanding prophet.
And if I could be so bold, then I will also say, if we shouldn't say it, then I'll say it anyway, that you should also read, if you're a leader in the church, whether you're ordained or not, and we have leaders all through, those of you who care about God, about faith, and about a journey, and about engaging in God's agency and understanding that it goes beyond the church, then I'd encourage you, implore you to pick up a copy of Leadership, God's Agency, and Disruptions, Confronting Modernity's Wager, co-authored with Mark Lau Branson and our guest, Alan Roxburgh. And it is available wherever you get your books, and check out your local booksellers and support them as best you can.
Very good.
Guys,
Very
it's
good.
been fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
doing
Thank
your
you for
good
the
work.
time. All right. Thanks again to Alan, generous with his time, and really paused to think in a few of those moments he was talking. So definitely want to get my teeth into that new book. Looking forward to that. And we have another special guest coming up this week that we want to remind everybody of.
Bonus episode this week.
Bonus episode.
Bonus episode, a contemporary of Alan Roxburgh, actually. So it's fitting that they both come the same week. Brian Mclaren. We're very excited about this. Look at that.
I just got Brian's new book, finished it a few days ago.
Yep.
And this is the new one, Faith After Doubt.
Yep.
So we're going to talk to Brian about this book and some other things that he's done in the past a little bit. But I know a lot of people know Brian, and I know our parish did a book study with Brian a little while back. And so we're looking forward to having Brian on, and that's coming out on Sunday.
Yeah, Sunday, watch short. Producer Iain will have it ready for you. We don't want him to have to do 2 in a row in 2 days.
No.
So, but the bonus episode is on Sunday. Once in a while, we're going to have a bonus episode for you. We got another one coming up in March where we added somebody who's pretty exciting. More about that later. But Brian is another one that's been pivotal for people like me and Rob, and really nurturing for us in ministry, because these are folks who have a prophetic voice, and they push the limits of what it is, and help us survive this institutionalism that we get bogged down in. So,
and it's
looking forward to it.
It's a gift when people like Brian and Alan can name things and put them in perspective that we're feeling and experiencing, but sometimes have a difficult time naming. So to put it out like that and be able to see ourselves in it is very transformative. So that'll be the same for our listeners too.
Shout out to Bishop Todd Townsend, Alan Roxburgh, great clergy conference guy. I'm saying, you agree?
Yeah,
Shout out
definitely.
Yep.
All right. Again, thanks to our sponsors as we wrap things up today, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and our friends at Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And guys, that was a great episode. Looking forward to Brian, and you take care. Okay. We'll be chatting with you soon. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Iain, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!